What does spirituality actually mean? Let's move beyond the belief stuff and everything else and actually start to understand what it means. So that's what I feel like I've been doing over the last couple years. I almost call myself like a spiritual synthesizer in a way, where I kind of take the opposite approach of stuff that you have heard of in like the 70s or 80s, where, people were traveling from the West to India to find their single guru that they were going to dedicate the rest of their life to and things like that. I take the complete opposite approach, where I'm like, I'm going to try to learn from everybody I possibly can, which means dozens and dozens of spiritual teachers and spiritual traditions and things like that. And I'm going to try to synthesize the kind of essence of what they're all pointing to. That's what I've really been doing over the last few years, is trying to understand, what is spirituality pointing to?
Kyle Kowalski is the founder of Sloww, a content destination and community for those exploring the art of living. Kyle's known on the internet for his ability to explore vast amounts of information and distill the core ideas so that you can apply them to your life. Over the past few years, Kyle has mostly been focused on exploring spirituality and the evolution of consciousness. In this discussion, we explore the core ideas that he's learned.
And it's led me to kind of define spirituality in terms of, as much as you can define something like spirituality, but I define it as spirituality is seeing who you are beyond your mind and self in your direct experience. So it's really as simple as that. But yeah, it's been eye-opening.
Something that Kyle and I agree on is that at some point, meditation evolves from a practice you do each day to your whole life becoming the practice.
Life is the practice. In the West, we have this misperception that meditation is something that you do, versus they're advocating that meditation is what you are. The more I've seen it, the more I've realized, oh yeah, like life is the practice.
Kyle has also explored the roots of many popular ideas about finding purpose in life. We discuss what he's learned about Ikigai and his updated version that reflects the original meaning of the word.
Four-circle diagram was actually created by someone who found a purpose diagram in Spanish, and it said purpose in the middle instead of Ikigai. And all this guy did was translate it to English and then swap the word purpose for Ikigai. Well, where did he get the word Ikigai from? He combined it, the four-circle purpose diagram, with a TED Talk that he watched from Dan Buettner, who's the founder of Blue Zones.
Before we get into this conversation, I want to ask you to join this amazing community of consciousness explorers. This whole idea of pursuing expanded consciousness and the boundaries of human potential while living a modern life is relatively new, which is why we interview revered masters, teachers, experts, and practitioners to help you on your own journey. To stay up to date on the latest conversations, simply click subscribe below and you'll be notified each time a new episode comes out. I am so grateful for all of your support and comments. I love reading them. Now let's dive into this conversation. Kyle, what's up, man?
How's it going, Scott?
It's going great. I have been enjoying sifting through the prolific amounts of information on the Sloww website, which we'll get into. But I think really where I want to kick things off is what was the catalyst for you to start to move into this interest in consciousness and spirituality versus just the mental mastery stuff that you spent a lot of time on?
Yeah, so I guess my story really doesn't get interesting until I turned 30 years old and had this massive, what I call self-diagnosed existential crisis. So I was working in marketing at the time. I was 8 years into my career, and marketing is known for the ebbs and flows of high hours and burnout and things like that. But it kind of comes and goes, right? You have a 40-hour work week followed by a 60 or 80-hour work week, and then it comes back down to 40. But at the time, I had been working 6 months straight of 60 to 80 plus hour work weeks. And this led to an existential crisis. Sure enough, it was, I think, the 1-2 punch of what I call burnout plus purposelessness. So fast forward, now I'm in my late 30s, so almost a decade later, and I didn't really get into a lot of the spirituality and consciousness stuff until I would say the last maybe 3 to 5 years, but probably more so the last 2 to 3 years. And that was an evolution and development that I didn't see coming. So the way that I kind of described my journey post-crisis was I continued to work in my career for 2.5 years after the crisis. I call those my 2.5 years of increasing cognitive dissonance, which I'm sure a lot of people can resonate with if they're an employee.
I know what that's like.
If they're an employee right now, the crisis kicked off the journey of introspecting and inquiring and starting to ask what I thought at the time were all the biggest questions about life. So It started with something along the lines of, am I really killing myself with work to sell people more stuff they don't need? Am I really here for this short time? Am I alive to do this? Am I alive for this? Is this the thing? And if it's not, then what is the thing? So that kind of kicked off all of this inquiry and searching process, which led me down a path of just learning, searching and learning a ton about life, about others, about humanity, about myself. And those 2.5 years of cognitive dissonance I describe as, I was learning all this stuff, especially about myself, but I was still showing up to my 9 to 5 or 8 to 9, 8 to 5 job every single day and living the same way. So that cognitive dissonance just built and built and built to the point where it was just reaching like a critical mass or a breaking point or a boiling point where I had to make a change. So 2.5 years post-crisis, I decided to just quit my career, take the leap of faith into entrepreneurship. And really, since then, I've explored everything from intentional living to life purpose to what you mentioned, mental mastery, which I really consider all the psychological stuff on the level of your mind. But the most interesting development in recent years has been all the stuff around spirituality and consciousness. And I grew up, I was socialized and conditioned or programmed, if you will, with Catholicism. So my parents raised me and my siblings Catholic. It wasn't hardcore in terms of like indoctrination or anything like that. We went to a Catholic grade school. We went to mass twice a week, most weeks, once for school, once with family. But if anyone was listening to this that was raised Catholic, you kind of know that as a kid, it goes in one ear and out the other because it's all habit and ritual, and it's just not very interesting. It's not doing what I think Catholicism was meant to do. I didn't even learn this until probably the last year or two, that the word Catholic actually means like a holistic worldview, like encompassing all these different perspectives. So like,
it's literally the opposite of what it is.
I know, right? Yeah. So it's like this fascinating thing to me. And this is kind of a little side note tangent where I can't remember what spiritual teacher said this, but someone said, if you haven't integrated the religion or spirituality that you grew up with, then you still have an aversion to something in there, like within, whether it's conscious or unconscious, that you need to kind of face to face and come to terms with, in terms of like, if you were raised in a certain religion and you're like, oh, I'm anti all of that now, I don't believe in any of that stuff or whatever it may be, you have to go a step further and kind of look at, well, why is that? And have you really tried to revisit it from like an adult perspective and the newfound perspective on which you're living life now versus, what you were raised with decades and decades ago. So I thought that was interesting because it has made me kind of revisit not just Catholicism, but Christianity in general, getting into more of like the non-dual Christianity, Christian mysticism and things like that. And it all starts to resonate a lot more than, I didn't understand it as a kid, it's in one ear and out the other, but all of that has been really, really interesting to revisit. But after that, I went to a Jesuit high school. In terms of what that means, some people may have heard of like Anthony de Mello or Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. These are some of the more well-known Jesuits from history. But again, I don't remember ever coming across any of their works when I was in high school or even college or anything like that. And by the time I got to college, I was completely out of any type of religion or spirituality whatsoever. And it wasn't until I met my wife a few years later that she got me into non-denominational Christianity, which I had no idea existed. So wait, you're telling me you can go to church and there's like a band and like a pastor that's not a priest, and they're actually talking about things that are relevant to your life and all this stuff. Like I had no idea that world existed at all. So I guess, in terms of being socialized and conditioned a specific way, it's kind of interesting, what you're raised with, and you think like, well, that's how the world is. Everybody kind of does it this way and whatever. And then you get exposed to something new and it blows your mind. So that opened a door for me. This was about 15 years ago now. And then I think, that opening of the door led into some of the openness that I had a decade later post-crisis of, okay, what does spirituality actually mean? Let's move beyond the belief stuff and everything else and actually start to understand what it means. And so that's what I feel like I've been doing over the last couple of years. I almost call myself like a spiritual synthesizer in a way, where I kind of take the opposite approach of stuff that you have heard of in like the 70s or 80s, where, people were traveling from the West to India to find their single guru that they were going to dedicate the rest of their life to and things like that. I take the complete opposite approach, where I'm like, I'm going to try to learn from everybody I possibly can which means dozens and dozens of spiritual teachers and spiritual traditions and things like that. And I'm going to try to synthesize the kind of essence of what they're all pointing to. And so that's what I've really been doing over the last few years, is trying to understand, what is spirituality pointing to? And it's led me to kind of define spirituality in terms of, as much as you can define something like spirituality. But I define it as, spirituality is seeing who you are beyond your mind and self in your direct experience. So it's really as simple as that. And we can dive into, what that means and how to do that and things like that after this. But yeah, it's been eye-opening. Like I said, I could have never guessed, based on how I was raised, that this is where I would have ended up if you would have asked me, 10 or 20 years ago. But I wouldn't change a thing. Similar to you in terms of you saying that your deepest interest is exploring consciousness, I would say that what has become the most interesting thing for me as well. And some teachers describe it as like you fall in love with truth, and the pursuit of truth and exploring what truth means and how life is unfolding truth in front of you. And so that's really resonated with me in terms of, I guess I am kind of falling in love with pursuing truth.
I love that. Yeah. For me, it's like truth. Like there's this concept in the lineage that I study called true reality. And true reality is like reality is in constant change. So it's impossible to like know it absolutely, but it's like the capacity to increasingly know the underlying laws of the universe and what this experience is and who you are as a part of it. And, I just find that to be way more interesting than how to grow an email list,
Yeah.
And like all of the shit that once consumed me. It's just the most enriching journey there is in my experience.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because I've seen a handful of people now who have moved beyond that, just grow an email list, make money, build a business, that whole thing. I've seen some people that have kind of woken up from that, if you will. And that's been really interesting, because for a few years here on my journey, I feel like I didn't see anybody. I felt like I was like almost on my own in terms of like, even the Wikipedia page for existential crisis didn't have much information on it, 8 or 9 years ago when I had my crisis. It's since blown up and it has a ton of information now. But I think this is a good thing in terms of the world becoming more interconnected, people realizing that we're more interconnected in general. But I have seen more and more people that are moving to what psychological development would call like post-conventional development. So moving beyond that achiever mindset doesn't necessarily mean that ambition or achievement or anything like that goes away, but your relationship with it changes. And I think that's the big difference.
That's right.
Yeah.
Did you have any type of like existential crisis or transformational conflict when this consciousness interest started to become a greater fixture in your experience?
So I think my biggest point of suffering or hitting rock bottom was my existential crisis, which was in late 2015. And it was like this 6-week acute crisis where I was just questioning everything about myself and about life. And that was kind of, in terms of like suffering and trauma and things like that, that was the low point for me. And what's interesting is, since then, over the last decade, the rest of it has felt less like suffering and more like openness and unfolding and emerging, and life just happening, almost like life is living you versus you living life. And so it's been more of like a synchronicity, surprise, and delight kind of thing than this like ongoing suffering or ego death feeling or anything like that. And I know different people. So Ken Wilber, for instance, who actually, funny enough, I'll give a shout out. He just launched a new book yesterday called Finding Radical Wholeness, which touches on a lot of these global spiritual traditions and things like that too. But he's most famous for his integral theory that he's been working on for decades now. And this is like the latest of his 25 plus books that he's published or whatever.
I was going to say, he's writes so many books. Another one.
Yeah.
Oh my
I think
gosh.
This is the 6th one that I've read. But I most recently read before this Integral Psychology and Integral Spirituality, and did a synthesis of those 2 books. And what's interesting, an interesting takeaway from those 2 is that he describes any level of psychological development that you have as a form of self-death. He calls it even like a death seizure or something like that, where it can feel psychologically like a death or like an ego death at any stage of development. So you could have a feeling of death here, and then you progress to a new level of psychological development, and then it feels like a death to the next level. And I think what he means by that is that it's a death to the level that you were at. And we can get into the subject object
Yeah.
relationship and things, but then you integrate it with the next stage that you go to. Now, not everyone buys stage theories. I find them actually a really helpful map in terms of how the mind develops. But that's how he describes it, is like, so it can feel like a death from this stage to this stage, but then you integrate, what you're leaving behind at the next level. And then that opens up a whole new worldview and perspective taking and meaning making for you. I haven't felt those deaths at every stage except for the crisis stage. And that was really from like I'm a big fan of Suzanne Cook-Greuter's ego development theory. That's probably my go-to human development theory, because it's all centered around the self and the development of the self. And everything else in your life is kind of a byproduct of that. So, and this gets into a whole bunch of spirituality stuff too, because I see the self and the subject object relationship, which is just another way of saying your relationship with yourself and the world. That is kind of the bridge between psychology and spirituality. We can talk more about that too, but yeah. So for me, this is a long-winded answer of saying that for me, the kind of suffering and the death experience was more so just in my acute existential crisis period. And then since then, I feel like I've just been really open to life for the last decade. And so the things that I've been discovering and learning and living have been more just joyful than trauma. Yeah.
That's beautiful, man. I'm happy for you. Your approach to kind of synthesizing all this information is definitely unique relative to other people I've had on the show. What are the benefits from your perspective on what's that's empowered for you?
So in terms of what I call having a synthesizing mind, and I actually got this term from Howard Gardner. He created like the multiple intelligences theory and the 5 frames of mind. And the synthesizing mind is one of those 5 frames. And he claims that he has a synthesizing mind himself. But this was another epiphany for me. And this happens, you've probably experienced this a bunch of times too, where you read something or come across something and it articulates something that you intuitively already knew about yourself, but you didn't have the words to say before. So it gives you something, it gives you a newfound way to articulate things like, it's like the epiphany, light bulb moment, eureka moment, any term you want to use of, oh my gosh, like it makes you want to sit back in your chair of like, that is exactly how I'm wired, or that's exactly how I experience it, or whatever it may be. I just didn't know that existed, or that there were terms or concepts or words for that. And being able to articulate something that you had an intuitive felt sense about is life-changing. So for instance, one of those moments for me was understanding that I had a synthesizing mind. I had no idea. I never heard the words, like, I probably heard the word synthesis before and had a general idea what that was, but like a synthesizer or a synthesist or a synthesizing mind, I had never heard these terms before. And when I came across it, it was that light bulb moment of, oh, that's exactly how my mind seems to be wired. Yeah, I do like go out into the world and try to find a ton of information, kind of sift through it, analyze it, and then synthesize the best pieces together into a more holistic and comprehensive understanding of whatever it may be. And again, I didn't build my mind. I didn't choose for my mind to be like this. It just happens to be how I'm naturally and nurturally wired. But again, it's a huge discovery upon reflection to realize, oh yeah, that is how my mind seems to work. And so what I do with anything, and again, this was kicked off by my crisis. So the crisis was the spark and continues to be the fuel for basically everything that I do. It kicks off this kind of flywheel circle of, and I didn't realize this until recently, it starts with inquiring or questioning. So everything starts with that. And then it goes to learning, and then it goes to developing. And then the developing, which you could call, again, vertical development, adult development, psychological development, any of these terms I kind of use synonymously. But what that does is it gives you perspective transformation, which allows you to do ever deeper questioning, to learning, to developing. And then assuming you're psychologically developing even further, it's ever deeper questioning. So this kind of gets into self-inquiry and things like that, and asking the question, who am I? If you would have asked me that question 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 2 years ago, I would have had different answers at every single stage of who am I versus how I would answer it now. So it's just really interesting to see how everything starts with questioning. The questioning gets you into learning, the learning gets you into developing, and then it's just a repeating cycle. And that's what I consider lifelong learning. But synthesizing in general, yeah, is just, I seem to be wired in a way where if I'm questioning something, I want to learn everything about it to the nth degree. I want to essentially exhaust the internet. And I consider exhausting the internet or exhausting a question or a search when you get to textbooks and research papers and Web 1.0 blogs and websites. That's when you've reached the end of the internet on a search about something. But yeah, and then that leads to the developing, and it just repeats.
Very, very cool. Very interesting to hear how your mind works. Where my mind goes is, so much of the spiritual realization wasn't related to consuming information. It was actually not a process of adding, but removing of things. And so like, I'm just, when we're talking about like running a business or like all these million things that we could learn, like expanding the intellect is like a super useful activity. And I'm just curious, like, has your biggest growth come from that? Has it come from the direct practices that have unfolded as a part of that? Like, I'm just interested, like, what is the role of all this information in your actual awareness?
Yeah. So for me, I think I'm lucky in the sense that this is where I view my existential crisis as a huge blessing versus, in the midst of it, it's obviously a very traumatic experience and things, and a dark place to be in. And that was when my wife said she was most worried about me. She had never seen me like that in life before. But now I view everything from my crisis as a huge blessing, because it being the spark to kick everything off and the fuel that continues to fuel everything, the way that I view learning is that all of the learning is in service of the living. So for me, the practice field and the playing field or the game field are one and the same thing. So let's see if I can kind of unpack this a little bit in terms that make sense. So everything that I'm searching and learning, I am testing almost in real time, consciously or unconsciously, against my lived experience of life. So if you view spirituality as your first person, subjective, internal, even phenomenological view of the world, and science as the third person, external and objective, I try to synthesize across both of those. So even reading spirituality books is an act of psychology on the level of your mind. But what it's doing for me, at least, is and then again, like I said, synthesizing across teachers and traditions and things like that, is I'm synthesizing the pointers. So I'm almost like building a map in my mind, the best possible map that I can to point beyond mind, if that makes sense. So all the learning for me is building the best possible map. Of course, the map is not the territory. And so then you have to use the map to see beyond mind. So for me, it's been, I would just say, I know for other people, and this is where it gets interesting because transformation can come in many different forms. Ken Wilber distinguishes here between waking up and growing up. So waking up can be mystical experiences, spiritual experiences, psychedelic experiences, going on a retreat for a weekend, meditating even. Any of these things can be waking up experiences, but a waking up experience really only takes you as far in terms of you being able to integrate it into growing up. And again, growing up is just a synonym for psychological development. So for me, yeah, the learning has never been about just knowledge accumulation. This kind of gets into the difference between what's called horizontal development and vertical development. So horizontal development, again, if you think of like an XY axis, horizontal development is the base of what you know. So it's information, knowledge, skills, anything you're adding to your mind. And then vertical development is how you know. So that is perspective taking and meaning making and all of those things. So horizontal is considered like knowledge transfer or translation, and vertical is considered transformation. And if you look at someone like Suzanne Cook-Greuter, who created ego development theory, or her colleague Beena Sharma, who runs the Vertical Development Academy, they both acknowledge that horizontal development, in terms of just learning, can be a catalyst to vertical development. It's obviously not always the case, but it can certainly be the case. And that's what I've experienced myself. And actually, that's how I sum up my purpose in a sentence these days, is that I synthesize lifelong learning that catalyzes deeper development. I could never have put that in a sentence years ago, but that sentence now applies not only to myself. It's like a play on words in terms of it applies not only for what I'm doing for myself, but it also applies to what I'm giving to other people through Sloww and things like that.
Very cool. Yeah, I totally agree that the way that everybody meanders along this journey is different, and there is no right way. And I think the way that is the right way is the way that feels most natural and aligned to you. And that's a part of the benefit of knowing thyself. And a question that I do have with this is, a lot of these different teachings, they advocate for different practices. And there does seem to be a benefit to depth of practice. It's like the alchemy of transformation is like, the repeated act of something over and over and over and over again, in most instances. And so I'm just interested, I imagine as you're exploring all these things, you're hearing all these different people telling ways to wake up and different practices associated with that. And, I definitely am curious how the integration of everything you're doing jibes with the just exposure to so many different practices and how that's balanced with depth.
Yeah. So for me, I guess another way to say is like, for me, life is the practice. So for instance, I heard recently, I think it was maybe from Rupert Spira, non-dual teacher, or his teacher, Francis Lucille, who basically said, like, in the West, we have this misperception that meditation is something that you do, versus they're advocating that meditation is what you are. And I'm actually,
I totally agree with
yeah.
that.
And so I'm seeing more and more teachers. And again, this was a thing where the more I've seen it, again, said in different ways, the more I've seen it, the more I've realized, oh yeah, like life is the practice. Then this is kind of why I sum up everything I do as like the art of living for students of life, because for me, it is all the art of living. And again, this is all sparked and fueled by my crisis. So I viewed my crisis as like, at the time, at least, as like a personal problem that I needed to solve. And that kind of kicked off this whole thing. But so again, if life is the practice itself, if learning is in the service of living, if the practice field and the playing field are one and the same thing, meaning the learning and the living are one and the same thing, I don't have like a checklist of practices in terms of like, I've got to meditate for 20 minutes. I've got to meditate for an hour. I've got to go on this week-long silent retreat. I've got to go on this latest and greatest, $5,000, event in some other international country. I actually don't do any of that stuff whatsoever. Because for me, again, like I said, I'm trying to take what I learn and apply it almost in real time. It's almost like the feedback loop of learning and living is crunched down to like one and the same without a gap. So other people, even in my marketing career, I would have read like, a book about like consumer behavior or human psychology or whatever it may be. And then I would think about like, how can I apply the things that I learned in this book to whatever XYZ marketing campaign we're running or whatever it may be. And it's like, you're trying to take what you learned and then force fit it into something. Whereas now it's like, I'm reading and learning for these almost these like automatic insights and epiphany moments and eureka moments that just happen. I'm not making them happen. Life makes them happen. And then that affects my living in real time. And then because it's affected my living, that then dictates the direction of what I then go learn about. And it's this kind of real-time feedback loop. So I'm probably not doing a good job of explaining it, and feel free to dive in and try to unpack it deeper. But that's kind of been the thing for me, is that like, oh yeah, life itself is the practice. The person coming to deliver something to your door is the practice. Taking your dogs out in the middle of a busy workday is the practice. All of these real life ordinary moments become way more extraordinary once you view life itself as the practice.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think reality is the best way to see yourself clearly, because you're fundamentally one and the same. But I guess for my own experience, there are like accompanying things that you do to continue to evolve that, like for me, my life is my practice. And the number one pointing for my evolution is to notice when I get taken out of peace, because it's indicative that there's something subconsciously that's causing that reaction.
Yep.
And so it's and like every judgment, every thought, every reaction to life is a way to see that underlying information in the consciousness more clearly, and to basically kind of continuously disidentify with it in a way that you just have more freedom.
Yeah.
So I totally am with you on this.
Yeah, I have a question for you actually in terms of that. Have you seen the gap get smaller between the reaction and your catching of the reaction, or your like reflection of the reaction? Because that's kind of what I've seen in terms of, I'll just give the example of like this one seems to happen all the time. So we've got 2 mini dachshunds and one of them's a puppy, and I'm taking them out constantly throughout the day because I work from home and my wife does not. And I'll find myself on the random day just being frustrated, like, man, like this is taking away from what I've got to do for my work. And then I almost immediately now catch myself and say, who am I that I think that like my work is this most important thing? And then you get into like the 5 whys of like, the next meta level of questioning, whatever it may be, of like, then that question goes into, well, who do I think I even am? And then, you get into all this self inquiry stuff that way. But I've noticed that gap getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So in terms of being taken out of it, it seems like a shorter period of time before you're able to catch yourself. And there's actually a stage in Suzanne Cook-Reuter's ego development theory called ego aware or construct aware, where it almost becomes real time, where you can watch your mind in action of it trying to tell a story, it trying to make a narrative, it trying to make you feel bad about something, whatever it may be. But yeah, I'll flip it over to you and see if you've experienced the same.
100%. The way I think about it is refinement. And so, originally maybe you just notice when you're like super overtly pissed off, and you start to work with that. And then you start to notice these instances where you're watching yourself getting triggered before that actually projects into the outside world. And then there's like a deeper refinement of like, you actually can notice the thought or the like something in your awareness, the process of something emerging before it even fully forms. And so it's just like a sensitivity that gets increasingly refined. And like, there's shit all the time that happens to me where I just get what I notice is the refinements, there's a global refinement, but then there's also with particular patterns as well, where like, there's certain things that are just super fucking deep for me. Like there's, wounds that have basically directed my entire life. And then there's other things that are, a little bit less of a big thing. And I noticed that refinement also tends to calibrate with like the depth of a particular pattern or concept or, just distortion in my subconscious is. So yeah, it's fascinating shit, man.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it in terms of refinements, almost like being able to see deeper and catch something earlier as it's starting to bubble up. Yeah, because, I think there are a lot of, again, this is another area where I feel like there are a lot of synonyms. Some people just refer to it as metacognition. Obviously, awareness is a key term. It means a million different things in spirituality. Then you've got psychological development. So you've got all of these different terms, but it kind of all points to the same thing in terms of being aware of your mind instead of thinking that you are your mind. And that to me is what the definition of awakening is. So awakening for me is when you no longer, and it's a very clear experience, I feel like, if you've had it, in terms of you no longer think you are who you thought you were your entire life up to that point. So you might not know who you are yet, but you know who you are not. So it's like saying like, I'm not sure who I am, but I am sure I'm not who I thought I was for my entire life up to this point. And that gets super interesting. And that kind of, kicks off a whole bunch of the spirituality stuff. But that is a very clear delineation for me. And again, this aligns with like Suzanne Cook-Reuter's ego development theory of when you're able to do this. You no longer think you are your mind. Your identity is no longer your ideas. Instead, you are now aware of your mind and you're able to observe and witness your mind. And because you're now aware of your mind and are no longer one and the same with it, and again, this gets into subject-object relationship. So you as subject are now aware of your mind as an object. And because you have that psychological distance, if you will, or awareness or whatever you want to call it, you can now reflect on your mind, question your mind, watch your mind in action, all of these different things. And that I feel like is going to be, assuming, when it ever happens, that'll be a complete game changer for the Western world. If, a tipping point or critical mass of people become aware of their minds instead of thinking they are their minds, that'll be a complete world changer.
I hope it happens in this lifetime.
Yeah.
So Susan Greuter says what 15 to 20% of the population is kind of experiences reality like that, something like that.
Yeah, so at least from the data that I've seen, and the key thing about her theory is that it came out of decades of her doing what she called MAP assessments, which is a maturity assessment profile, and she did 10 to 15,000 of these, and they're literally like sentence completion tests where it's like, my ideal relationship is, and it's like a blank and you fill in the blank, or the best boss in the world would be insert, like fill in the blank. And then someone literally hand codes, everything. And what that shows is like the level of self that someone currently identifies with. It identifies your current subject of who you think you are and what you can then therefore take as object. And her data shows that 80% of the Western world is still in the conventional levels of development. And the peak of the conventional levels of development are thinking that you are self-made, that you're following the American dream. You pulled yourself up.
You're killing it.
You pulled yourself up by your bootstraps. You are the one who is self-authoring, your level of effort and determination and discipline and everything else. And it's all up to you. And so therefore, sole responsibility and credit and desert and reward is all in your hands. And if you fail, it's all because of you. And so everything, in terms of free will and moral responsibility and everything else kind of comes along with that. But that is what the Western world socializes and conditions humans for currently, is that peak of thinking that you're the self-made. She calls it like self-determining, is like that final stage of the conventional level. And so 80% of her data shows that 80% of the Western world is still in the conventional levels up to that stage. And then the next level is the first stage of post-conventional development. And to your point, all of those back end stages, like the back half of the stages that she's currently identified, only maybe 20% of the Western world has reached those. And then each stage in those post-conventional stages is a fewer and fewer percent, right? So by the time you get to like her final stage, which she hardly has enough data on at this point, which is like the transcendent stage, which is what aligns with spirituality, witnessing, perspective, transcendent, she would say like less than 1% of the Western world is in that stage. So, and then you backtrack from that, from that to like the stage before that is like ego aware, construct aware. There's maybe like 3 to 5% of people in that stage. And then a little bit more in the stage before that, and then a little bit more for that. But yeah, all of those combined, it's like maybe 20%. Yeah.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation so far. If you like what you hear, let me know by clicking like, subscribing to the channel, and responding with a comment around something that you found interesting in the conversation so far. In addition to these videos, I do a lot of writing on the exploration of consciousness and my own personal revelations in my newsletter called Consciousness: The Doorway to Human Evolution. To receive these updates and more, all you need to do is simply head to the link in the description below and you'll be added to the community of 20,000 plus consciousness explorers receiving weekly ideas and inspiration in their inbox. I look forward to hearing from you there. Now let's get back to the show. I find these models and data points like so informative and useful because they basically just show you how the reality that you live within is just an expression of the consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where it's like you go on YouTube and you look at, and I'm sure you feel this, experience this with your blog, and you look at like, what are the top YouTube videos? And it's like mostly about making money, getting abs, starting a business, blah, blah, blah. It's like a literal, and then you look at the people talking about some of this stuff and it's like, 1/10 of the views or whatever. And so it just is so interesting to me how direct of a correlation it is to many of these models. And really the things that our society values, the products we create, the companies we build, the way we do things, it's all just an expression of the consciousness.
Yep. And yeah, I mean, man, there are like three different directions in my mind right now of where we could go with that. Again, Ken Wilber talks about that. I think Ken Wilber maybe has something where he's like 10% of the population has to reach the next stage of development before those principles and values and things like that start to infuse the mainstream. So that's kind of an interesting thing I've kept in the back of my mind. Like, so it does
he talk about the metaphysics of that at all? Like, I know like people like David Hawkins will literally talk about, I don't know if you've read his work, where it's like, that's not just a content thing, that's a metaphysical influence where like the energy of those people is like lifting the energy of other people. I don't know if you have spent any time with that, but I just was curious if Ken talks about it.
I'm somewhat familiar with Hawkins, like map of consciousness and things like that. I have a couple of his books on my reading list. Wilber talks about it more so. I mean, he obviously gets into all the spirituality and consciousness stuff, but I feel like he almost ends it by tying it back more practical in terms of like, he's very clear. He's like the techno-economic base, I think he calls it, always runs ahead of society's like culture and wisdom. So it's like certain things are always running ahead, and then like, people are playing catch up to it. So, I mean, we've heard that whole thing of like, we're drowning in information, but starving for wisdom. So that's kind of a similar idea of like, we're living in the digital information overload age, but where's all the wisdom? Or like the World Wide Web hasn't yet become the World Wise Web. So there are different ways that this is some of the language I use in my synthesizer course that I launched recently. And the other one I use is like the information revolution hasn't yet become the integration revolution. So again, getting back to synthesis and things like that. But yeah, so that's kind of the way that Wilber describes it. But so I've always found it interesting, and I don't know where he's getting that 10% number from, if there's actually data or empirical research to back that up. But I found that kind of interesting in terms of like, it doesn't take 51% to become a tipping point. It's a smaller, like grassroots kind of ground up thing that starts to infuse from there and emerge from there. So that's kind of cool. And that makes me more hopeful in terms of, okay, a smaller percent of us only have to get on board, and then we'll start to see it more. But to your point, that's funny that you mentioned the one about six-pack abs, because I've often used this as a thought experiment in terms of like a free will thought experiment, and like, where do your desires and wants come from and things like that. Like, why I grew up in organized sports my entire life and ran cross country and track in college even. But, now, decades removed from any type of organized sport or anything, I think about like, why don't I have a desire for six-pack abs? I see all these photos on Instagram, and to your point, videos on YouTube and whatever, and everyone's trying to sell me, getting fit and all this stuff. I've been in decent shape my whole life and whatever. I'm like, why don't I have a desire for a six-pack? And so then you start questioning that. And then it's like, I didn't create any of my desires or wants in the first place. And then you get to the meta level of that, of how would you even create a want for a new want? This gets into some of there's a philosopher named Galen Strawson who I love his stuff, because it's another one of those aha moments of reading it. And I'm like, thank God there's at least one other person on the planet that is thinking like this. But he has a ton of good stuff about luck, and that luck swallows everything in the end. And he has the meta example of like, if you wanted to create new wants, how would you have created the first want to create the want for the new want? And so it's like an infinite regress of, ultimately it ends in, Sam Harris describes it like it ends in darkness, or it ends in mystery, or it ends in the wilderness of, you just don't know. You end up, if you ask why enough times, you end up with an I don't know. And it's just a mystery. I don't know why I don't want six pack abs.
Yeah. And you can either enjoy that, I don't know. You can either enjoy it and rest in it, or you can be plagued by it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And maybe that's one of the differences.
That, you know,
yeah.
Go ahead.
That's actually one of the differences that Suzanne Kugreuter talks about. Like in the conventional levels, it's all about certainty. So I don't know isn't an acceptable answer if you're at that level of psychological development. But then once you enter the post-conventional stages, you start to build uncertainty and be comfortable with uncertainty. And you start to realize all the paradoxes and contradictions and, we contain multitudes and all these different things about life that just don't logically or rationally make sense sometimes. But yeah, so it won't be until more people reach the post-conventional levels that uncertainty starts to, be a bigger thing and people are okay with, I don't know.
Yeah, I definitely spent a long time just living in fear of uncertainty, and holy shit, does it feel good to be more on the other side of that. A question I had for you as you were talking about that luck thing, I think it's quite interesting. I don't know if you spent a lot of time studying in all of the kind of wisdom tradition information that you've looked at, spent a lot of time looking at karma. But I'm interested kind of like about this luck hypothesis and then how that aligns to karma.
Yeah, so I'll be the first to admit that I'm not an expert on karma. I've looked into it here and there, and and a lot of this has stemmed from conversations that I've had with people on Twitter, because a lot of the free will stuff gets you into people bringing up reincarnation and transmigration and past life memories and near-death experiences. And,
what's transmigration?
I don't even know if I could do a good job of explaining it here. And I actually don't know off the top of my head the difference between reincarnation and transmigration. So I guess that's just going to have to be a search for people.
We'll put a pin on that one.
Yeah, maybe that's a round two. We can both look into it and come back.
Okay.
But these are some of the things that people have brought up to me in terms of like, oh, you need to look into this. What about this? And there are people that claim to have memories from being in the womb before they were born, like their fetal life. There are people who claim to have previous past life, memories of things. I'm a little bit more skeptical of a lot of that stuff, only because I've studied like all of the cognitive biases and fallacies and things that of like how the mind can go wrong in terms of like confabulation and remembering false memories, memory implantation, dreams being remembered as memories that didn't actually happen. It was actually just something dreamt. There's so many ways that the mind can deceive you, obviously. So I'm not positive of all of that. So again, this is what I try to do, right? I try to look at everything. There's almost nothing that I just rule out just because like, oh, that's just too out there to not even look into. I try to get a holistic perspective on any subject that I'm diving into, to the point where I'm testing it against my own lived experience. So again, this is where like going out into the world of information, like, and science and things like that. So all the third person stuff, I'm testing against my first person lived experience. And so when I really pay attention is like, okay, something that I have come across in the world, third person or third hand, matches up to my lived experience. So the learning and the living have aligned. And that's kind of what I would consider consilience, which is a word that means that multiple things from different disciplines point to the same kind of conclusion or point to the same thing. And so for me, it's consilience when, okay, this thing I'm learning about aligns with how I'm living. The first and third person have aligned. If there's no third person research about something, and then I don't have any first person experience of it, so neither of the two are aligning, then it's like, it's tough for me to spend a lot of time looking into something like that, because it's like, there's no basis for me to look into it other than it might be interesting. Right. So it's like, for me personally, I don't remember being born. I have no past life memories. I don't remember my first memory in this life, which they call like infantile or childhood amnesia. Most people don't have their first memory until 2 to 4 years old. And now I would say that applies to me. I don't even remember what my first memory was, might be even later. So for me, it's tough to get on board with some of that stuff. And now, of course, there's always the, what do they call it? Like the hypnosis and regression stuff and things like that, where,
past life regressions.
Yeah, things like that. So maybe there are things that I just need to try and go into and see what happens. But but that's kind of, I guess, me just off the top of my head going through my thought process of when I feel like something is worth looking into a little bit more versus when it's not. It's so for me, it's not something.
How
Yeah.
I was going to ask, like, how would you do, like, cause like there's a lot of things in spiritual traditions that are consistent, but there's no research on them because scientifically we're just at a certain level of development. And so like, would you look at something that has been mentioned, if it's like, okay, this has been mentioned like 10 times across these 10 different traditions or 10 different things. But like, would you consider that research? Like, would you consider that kind of like a coalescence or research? I forget what the word you used.
Yeah, I would think that would be interesting, right? Because especially, thousands of years ago, if geographically separated places were coming up with similar things, pointing to similar things where they couldn't have been communicating with each other, that's really interesting, right? There's actually a concept called like multiple discovery, and then maybe another one called like simultaneous invention or something like that, which is pretty wild to look into in terms of different areas on Earth at similar periods of time, but in different geographic places, coming up with the same thing. And so like that's pretty wild. So yeah, something like that.
Here's a fun fact about reincarnation. It was actually part of Christian doctrine until 527 AD.
Really? Huh.
Yeah, and a pope basically, I think it was actually a Catholic pope, actually outlawed it and took it out of the Bible. So you can look that up, but it's really fascinating because I think for a lot of us that have been conditioned Christian, it's such a far out idea. It's like, I mean, how could that possibly be a thing? But it actually was a part of Christianity, and it's a part of Taoism, and it's a part of Hinduism, and it's a part of many of these completely separate things. And the only reason that it's not a part of our current culture as people that kind of grew up as Christians is because of a pope, which I find to be very fascinating.
Yeah, I do find that fascinating, and also sadly not surprising given that like even as recently as like was it like the 1980s maybe or 90s or something, like Anthony DeMello was basically like outcast for the stuff that he was a Jesuit priest, and he was basically outcast. They banned his books essentially and all this stuff, and I'm like, and all Anthony DeMello is saying, like, Anthony DeMello is a great gateway for anyone who's at the beginning stages of starting to question their socialization and conditioning. How did my mind ever become my mind in the first place? How to, learning language, all the ideas that you were indoctrinated with growing up and things like that. He's an excellent gateway for that. But that leads to a bunch of doubts and a bunch of questioning, which, a lot of people don't like. So it doesn't surprise me, unfortunately. That's been going on for hundreds, even thousands of years that, people have been changing history, rewriting history and things like that. But to your point about, so the other thing I guess I'll say on reincarnation, again, not being an expert by any means on this, but the things that I've seen are that, what does someone mean by reincarnation? Do they mean that you, in terms of your like finite mind of who you think you are at the level of the mind, gets reincarnated into, new lives and things like that? Or are they talking about, awareness, consciousness reincarnates in new forms and things like that? Because that's a completely different thing, right? In terms of thinking that like this, unique individual finite form gets reincarnated in some way, shape, or form. This gets into even like simulation theories and mind uploading and things like that. Because are you really your mind, or are you awareness and consciousness of your mind? And then the whole karma piece is interesting because I'm sure you're familiar with like Buddhism's like dependent origination and concepts around like interdependence and things like that. Hinduism and Advaita Vedanta, I feel like, get this really well in terms of just the interconnectedness of things. And yeah.
It's just an interesting thread to explore with the karma thing, because if you do believe in reincarnation and you do believe that like essentially like every action has a consequence and you're kind of accountable to that in some form, it's like, what is your luck really? It's like, it's of your own creation at some point in your journey. And I think the fact that that's much harder to explain if you don't believe in reincarnation, because it's like, well, why did I get a shitty birth lottery as I've heard you describe, right? But it's like, if you have this, if you were open to the perspective that like you've had 1,000 incarnations and you've done all these things and all these lives, all these different people, and you know, there's stuff you're here to learn and there's bills you have to pay for that and like all that kind of stuff. Like, yeah, it is a fascinating thing to think about.
I mean, even regardless of reincarnation, it seems clear that life is one interconnected thing, if you could even call it a thing, or a process, or a system, or whatever you would want to term it. That seems pretty clear, and it seems clear that everything, even the smallest, subtlest, seemingly insignificant thing, everything affects everything, and everything is in context of environment, a relationship, or whatever it may be. So all of that seems pretty clear, even from like a scientific perspective. This made me think of Nora Bateson, who does a lot on like complexity theory and systems thinking and systemic thinking and things like that. And she gives an example of like, where's the edge of a deer? So for instance, like a deer will shed its antlers, the antlers will fall on the forest floor. They'll then be home for bacteria and all these different things, and it'll decompose and it'll be fungi. And so like, and then that leads to, you know, this whole ecosystem of things that are interconnected and happening. And so her question is, where is the edge of the deer? And so she gives the same example for an individual human. Where is the edge of an individual human? No individual human is self-created. Everybody is other created. Even your sense of self is other created. You have to, and then you have to have a sense of self before you're able to see that you have a sense of self. It's like this weird paradox of like every human has to be socialized or conditioned before they can realize they've been socialized and conditioned. It's like this order of events thing, but everything is interconnected. So regardless of the reincarnation piece, it's like all of that seems very clear. And just in terms of science, even lived experience, subjective lived experience of like everything is impacting and affecting everything at all times.
No doubt. No doubt. The butterfly effect. One thing I was curious about, I know you did like a evolved perspective on the Ikigai, which I think is like a concept that a lot of people, they see it and they go, oh yeah, I love this. This makes sense. But you kind of have a hot take on it that I thought would be fun to hear about.
Yeah. So this is another example of just what I seem to do where I was looking for, after my crisis in 2015, I spent all of my free time essentially in 2016 and 2017 trying to find purpose. And so asking all those questions about yourself, even asking the question, what is purpose in the first place? And like most people, I'd stumbled across that 4-circle Venn diagram of Ikigai. But again, since I'm wired as a synthesizing mind and have to, for whatever reason, again, no choice of my own, as far as I'm aware of, I have to exhaust the subject. And so that meant exhausting Ikigai. Where did this 4-circle diagram come from? Who created it? What was it inspired by? Like all these different things. And that led to realizing that the 4-circle diagram was actually created by someone who found a purpose diagram in Spanish, in the Spanish language. So it was just 4 circles in Spanish, and it said purpose in the middle instead of Ikigai. And all this guy did was translate it to English and then swap the word purpose for Ikigai. Well, where did he get the word Ikigai from? He combined it, the 4-circle purpose diagram, with a TED Talk that he watched from Dan Buettner, who's the founder of Blue Zones. If people aren't familiar with Blue Zones, it's the like handful of places on Earth where humans live to be over 100 years old on average. So the highest per capita number of centenarians or super centenarians even. So one of those is Okinawa, Japan. And that's where the concept Ikigai came from, or at least was popularized from, was Dan Buettner's Blue Zones work. So this guy watched this TED Talk, found this purpose diagram, translated it into English, just swapped purpose for Ikigai. That was a big uncovering for me. And actually years later, he actually talks about, you know, the whole thing about exactly that, about how he created it and whatever, but he did create a viral meme. So I actually think, even though it has nothing to do with Ikigai, I actually think he's done the world a favor just in terms of more people looking for purpose and all of that. On the flip side, it is not Ikigai. And so what I did was I started to look into the actual Japanese concept of Ikigai. So I think I read like 5 books on the subject. The challenge here is that I don't speak Japanese, and a lot of these books haven't been translated to English yet. Like there's some textbooks and things like that, and I'm not able to read those, or I'm looking for like, you know, partially translated excerpts of those or whatever. But so I started diving into, well, what is Ikigai actually? And what I decided to do ultimately, again, this is while I was searching for purpose myself, was I decided to redesign the 4-circle diagram. So I could have just started from scratch and say, I'm going to create a brand new Ikigai concept that actually matches the truth of what Ikigai is. But given that the world is already on to this viral 4-circle meme, maybe I'll have better odds of getting this out there if I just update and redesign the 4 circles that already exist. So the 4 circles, if people aren't aware, are what you love, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can get paid for. And the biggest myth of that 4-circle diagram is the circle, what you can be paid for. So that has absolutely nothing to do with the Japanese concept of Ikigai. In fact, Ikigai doesn't even have to do with work. It doesn't even have to be, what you do for a living or what you call work. It's more so related, again, getting into some of the spirituality stuff, more so like a reason for being, and how you're like listening to life and seeing life, live through you, like, and then, paying attention to life, listening to life, being aware of life, seeing what lights you up in life, and then responding accordingly. And, the more that you do that, the more it feels like play instead of work. And it's joyful instead of suffering, and it's regenerative instead of degenerating. It's like following the things that resonate with you and pull you in a direction that just feels good and lights you up. So reason for being is a much better term for it. But what I decided to do was just redesign the 4 circles. I completely wiped the one about what you can be paid for, and instead I made that a byproduct. Because again, all of these psychological development theories about your sense of self and things like that, you need to discover who you are first and foremost. And then if you want to be paid for that, it can be an optional byproduct of your purpose in motion in the world. It's not going to be for everybody, right? Because I fully believe that your purpose could be being a good parent. And that's an unpaid thing that isn't considered like work necessarily. So, and some people, I think that could be like their thing, like their primary thing. And I think that's great. I think some people are literally like, I know some people who I'm like, man, that is just like the epitome of the definition of like a great mom or whatever it may be, or a great dad. The reason I mention that is because I read Simon Sinek's book, Find Your Why, when I was looking for purpose. And he specifically says that being a parent can't be your purpose.
He says that.
And now he wrote the book with like two other people maybe. And so maybe that was their idea and he just has his name on the book. I don't know for sure, but that was surprising from the guy who created the Start With Why thing.
Yeah, that is fascinating.
But
I really do like though, like, that notion of like what you can get paid for. I think we have a tendency as humans to view things in like a polarized way. And it's really easy to use that to like create some type of conditionality where it's like, well, I would do these things, but like someone's probably not going to pay me for it. And I've just seen time and time again where when people kind of take money out of the equation and just do the thing, like you're right, the money follows.
Yeah. Yeah. And I got that from, a few people talk about it. Naval Ravikant talks about that. He has like his founder product market fit 3-circle. I turned it into like a 3-circle Venn diagram thing, but that matches Jim Collins, famous for his good to great concept, has a hedgehog concept that is similar. There are a lot. So that's what I did. And I turned this whole thing into like Ikigai. I called it Ikigai 2.0. I turned it into an ebook. It's like a short 100-page ebook that includes a workbook. But it essentially walks through the truth of Ikigai, of what I discovered, how I redesigned the concept, how I applied the concept to myself, how I used it personally to find purpose. And then the back half of the book is if you want to optionally monetize it, here's how to do that. But one of the big things I got was from Maria Popova, who runs the Marginalian, formerly called Brain Pickings. She talks about how everything she's ever done for the 15 to 20 years she's been doing it has been personal development first and business development as a byproduct. So for her audience of one, herself, all of her learning and development has been her thing first and foremost. And then all of her audience that she's built and any business that she's built has purely just been a natural byproduct of her doing it for herself and just putting it out in the world. And that really resonated with me. Abraham Maslow, famous for the hierarchy of needs, has a similar thing. He calls it metapay, where at certain levels of self-actualization or self-transcendence, your paycheck is no longer in the form of just monetary stuff, you're being meta paid in terms of living your purpose, giving yourself beyond yourself to the world. And there may be some monetary pay that comes as a byproduct of that, but that is not what your primary, first and foremost objective is. So all of these different things, again, synthesizing all of these together, they all kind of point to the same thing. And that resonated with me. I wanted to find something. I've always had like entrepreneurial dreams, but I wanted to find something that was giving myself to the world in a way that was just completely authentic and natural. And then the business developed as a byproduct over time.
I think that's a much more sustainable, enduring, and fulfilling mindset. And I also think the MetaPay thing is interesting because, a lot of people, they look at this consciousness or spirituality path and they look at these levels of development and they try to poke holes in it by going, well, okay, why isn't that person that's like over here kind of more in the enlightened path, like not rich? Like, where's the proof in the pudding, without understanding that like the payoffs are just different as you go down that path. Like the money stuff, yeah, there's some basic needs stuff that needs to be handled, but that's not why that no longer becomes a primary motivator for why you do things.
Yeah. And I think this is another really interesting thing in terms of all things money, because there were a couple of things I had learned recently. One was from Morgan Housel, who wrote The Psychology of Money. The other was from Daniel Kahneman, but they both say the same things in terms of your views on money are actually pretty solidly formed by the time you're like 18 years old. So Morgan Housel talks about it in terms of, again, he talks about it in terms of the lottery of birth stuff, in terms of like, you're born in a certain time and place to certain parents, and your parents have a certain level of wealth. You're born in a certain economic environment, a certain financial environment. Your views on money are pretty formed by the time you're an early adult. And then Daniel Kahneman says that your satisfaction with your income at age 18 determines your satisfaction with your income as an adult. And so this is super interesting. Again, this is something that a lot of people won't even dive into until they start, questioning their own socialization and conditioning and how they feel about money. But for me, it's interesting because I was never in my life primarily motivated by money, even though I started working at like age 13 or 14 and haven't stopped since. But money was never a primary motivator for me. For me, it was always about my self-worth was tied directly to my work. So I always thought that if I did really good work, one, I would feel complete and valuable and useful as a person and feel whole as a person. And as a byproduct of that, I would make money because I'm doing good work. And that has led through school for me, sports, professional career, the whole deal. That's also probably why it was easier for me to quit my career and walk away from, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, because money was never a primary motivator for me. Whereas someone who is primarily motivated by money is going to have a much tougher time, quitting their career, even if they have entrepreneurial dreams. But again, they're going to have to get through that phase of starting to question, well, why do I care about money so much in the first place? How was I raised? How was I wired? Like, what was my nature and nurture and all of that? So that is just an interesting little side tangent about all of the money stuff about, there's a lot of socialization and conditioning about why people view money the way they do.
Yeah, definitely. And, coming back to the church thing, there's a lot of really destructive conditioning that comes from that. I remember, there's a quote in the Bible that I just feel like remember. It was like, it's easier to get into heaven. Like, it's easier for a camel or something to get into heaven than like a greedy person. I'm butchering the hell out of it, but that's the point. And it was just like, oh, money is bad. Like, money is bad. Money is evil. If you like money, you're going to hell.
Yeah.
That was like the sense making that like, Bible school Scott got drilled into his head, and it's taken a long time to unwind that. And, it truly is wild. And you'll see this as, it's cool that you are so tuned into this before you become a parent, because it's like, man, just like the exposure of what you put in front of your kids, you realize like how directive it can be for the rest of their lives.
Oh yeah.
Once you start to see it in your own life.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm very glad. I'll just say I'm very glad that we're having kids 10 years later than we would have. My wife and I we have a baby girl on the way, and she'll be here in a few weeks. And she'll be like a 13-year wedding anniversary gift for for my wife and I. So we waited a long time. We're in our late 30s. We waited a long time to have kids, but we joke all the time. Like, I can't imagine having a kid, pre-crisis for me. Like the things that I've learned in the last decade, I feel are completely priceless. And I say all the time, like, someone couldn't pay me if there was a time machine that existed. Someone couldn't pay me $1 billion to go back in time and erase, the things that I've experienced over the last decade. There's no amount of money that you could put on it. And so, yeah, I'm very glad that I think we're going to be in better shape having a kid now than a decade ago.
Amazing, man. Well, I want to close this out with giving you an opportunity to just tell people more about some of the cool things you're putting out in the world, because there's a lot of them.
Yeah. So I guess the first thing to do, if anyone's interested, in this conversation has sparked anything or piqued anyone's interest, is just go visit sloww.co. So that's sloww.co. That'll have all the information on there. It'll have all the different stages that I call slow stages. So from intentional living to life purpose to mental mastery to what I call spiritual seeing. I feel like spiritual growth is a bit of a misnomer since it's beyond mind. But all of that is right there on the homepage. I have a Slow Sunday newsletter that I send almost every week. And then, I've got different products depending on what stage you feel like you're at and what questions you're asking yourself at any given time. So I've got ebooks. I've got like I said, that Ikigai 2.0 ebook. I've got a free hierarchy of happiness ebook. So this was something that I worked on years ago in terms of asking myself, what is happiness? And that led to synthesizing over 100 different perspectives on happiness and kind of putting those into a framework where you go from all the external stuff of how you define happiness and that gets into all the money and the house and the cars and the clothes and all that kind of stuff, all the way up through psychological happiness, all the way up to spiritual happiness and what that means. So that's a free ebook that I give away to people that sign up for the newsletter. I have a product called Mini Mind that is all the stuff I've learned about cognitive biases and fallacies. I've got another product called Wise Walk for anyone who's interested in more of the spiritual stuff. So right now we're going through every week of the year and learning from a different spiritual teacher. So we're about halfway through the year almost, and it's just been completely fascinating and eye-opening to hear from so many different spiritual teachers and see where the dots connect between them. It's kind of taking us full circle back to the beginning of the conversation of
it's a really cool idea. I love that idea, especially for people that are like in the early phases and are like, what's out there? You know what I mean? Like, I want to just like dive in and just see what's going on with all this.
It's been a lot of the feedback from people that have been doing it is about the themes that you start to hear the same stuff over and over and over. They might be using different teachers use different words and point to things in different ways, but they're all pointing at the same thing. And so that's kind of the key. And it's interesting to hear different perspectives on it. And then the most recent thing that I'll end with, I guess, is I just launched my first course finally after literally working on it for years. And it's called Synthesizer. And so it's everything that I've learned about the synthesizing mind, my own mind, other synthesizers out there. So some that we've touched on already in this conversation, actually all of them, I think. We talked about Ken Wilber, Howard Gardner, Maria Popova. They're all highlighted throughout the course. Suzanne Cook-Greuter's ego development theory is in the course. So really it goes through my entire process of how I synthesize information. And actually one student, I never thought about it this way. Again, this is another benefit of being able to articulate something that you couldn't before. One student described it as synthesis as a way of life. And I thought that was really interesting in terms of thinking through like the whole process from questioning to learning to developing and all of the pieces and components within that, from reading to note-taking to summarizing to synthesizing to writing to creating to discussing with others to developing your projects and products and ideas to developing your sense of self. All of that is covered in the course. So it's probably the most comprehensive thing I'll ever make. It's like 10 hours of self-guided content, but there are live calls as well. So what we're trying to do is curate for the first time a global community of synthesizers. So for those who think they might have a synthesizing mind, check it out.
That's really cool. And maybe that can be a synthesis of the community of synthesizers.
Yeah. Metasynthesis. Yes. It always can go one level more, right? So
that's right. That's right. Amazing, dude. Well, all awesome stuff. I will link all that out in the show notes for anybody that's interested. And Kyle, it was amazing to hear about your journey and just, how you experience all this stuff. I loved it, man. So many good nuggets in here and perspectives, and I appreciate what you're doing in the world.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Scott, and look forward to continuing to explore consciousness with you.